Australia, the home of big rocks, black stumps and chaswazzers. Austria, however, is the home of Freud, Mozart and slow motion. It would be a safe assumption to say that these countries don't have the most in common, yet they have one thing very much in common: their names. How do two countries in different hemispheres end up having names so similar that even certain world leaders can get them mixed up? The name Austria is a Latinization of its native German name Österreich. This derives from the Old High German word Österreichi, which means Eastern Realms due to Austria being east to Germany. The earliest recording of this name comes from the Österreichi document dated 1st of November 996. While this doesn't mean that the country of Austria is just over 1000 years old, it does mean that the name we all know it as in the English world laid its roots just over 1000 years ago. The area of land that covers Austria has had an interesting history, from belonging to the Celtics, the Romans and the Germans. However, I'm just here to explain the names and am nowhere near qualified to discuss the fascinating history of Austria. So let's go back to that old High German word for the Eastern Realms, Österreichi. Of course, modern German is different to Old High German, but some similarities are still there. East in modern German is Osten, which matches with the Os at the start of Österreichi, which of course became Österreich, which in turn became Austria. As we all know, this name has led to some confusion. It's the very reason this video exists. And that's because of the similar sounds Osten has with another compass direction in another language, which brings us nicely to our next country. Notos is the Greek god of the southern wind. When this god came to the Romans, however, they came to call him in Latin by a different name, Oster. When the Greek wind system was adopted by the Romans, the name Oster became used for the south wind. This name evolved into the idea of Terra Australis. Terra Australis was the idea of a continent on the southern hemisphere of the Earth and even appeared on maps. Between the 15th and 18th century, there was no clear evidence that Terra Australis actually existed, but people just presumed that if there was a huge amount of land in the north, then it must be balanced in the south. The actual name Australia has its earliest recordings from 1625 in A Note of Australia del Espiritu Santo, written by Sir Richard Hakluyt. This came from a corruption of Australia del Espiritu Santo, which means in Spanish, Southern Land of the Holy Spirit, a name for an island in Vanuatu. Matthew Flinders popularised the name in 1814 when he circumnavigated the continent. The name subsequently was used in official reports, and in 1824 the name was officially adopted. So there we have it, two countries with very similar names and rather similar origins, both related to compass directions but different directions in different languages, which however sound somewhat similar in the languages they're spoken. So why do Austria and Australia have such similar sounding names? A pure coincidence, albeit a coincidence revolving around the same subject. There's got to be a name for that. Why don't you guys tell me what it is down below? Or if that word doesn't exist, why don't you guys coin a word for it and tell me down below? I really enjoyed your ideas for Gangagoo last time. Name explain, we always try and live by the mantra that every name has an interesting story, and sometimes when I'm struggling to make a video idea interesting because the core etymology of the video is kind of dull, I can usually find a way to pull it out of the bag and make it interesting and craft a story in a good, enjoyable way. I mean, I hope anyway. Seriously, I really do think that any name can be interesting. However, I'm pushed to my limit in this ideology thanks to one nation in particular, and that nation being none other than Australia. Though before we get into this, I have to say that while I've never been there myself, Australia seems like a lovely nation full of great people, and many things I adore derive from Australia. And Name Explained probably wouldn't be the success that it is today without the name of Australia sounding very similar to another nation. I really hope my Australian viewers see the lighter side in all this, as despite how much love I have for the nation, I have one qualm about this country, and you can clearly see what that qualm is in the name of this video. Australia sucks at naming things. The nation is littered with places and things that have really literal, obvious, dull and uninteresting names. The kind of names where you don't need someone like me to explain them. But here we are, and through some weird series of events, I've been tasked with the challenge of writing an interesting video about uninteresting names. So I'm tackling this by asking myself, why are these names uninteresting? And hopefully that ends up being interesting unto itself. However, a great place to start with these uninteresting names is with the names of the states that Australia is split up into. Australia is split into 7 states, however not all of these states have the dullest names. FLINDERS. In fact, the 4 easternmost states of Australia do have rather interesting names. From north to south, these 4 states are Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and the island state of Tasmania. Queensland was named after the British Queen Victoria, who on the 6th of June 1859 signed an agreement to separate the colony from New South Wales, allowing it to become its own state. Unsurprisingly, the state of Victoria too is named in honour of Queen Victoria, as she was still Queen of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, which Australia was a part of, when the colony was established in 1851. New South Wales is actually the oldest state in Australia. It was named by Captain James Cook in 1770. He initially named it just New Wales, but eventually changed it himself to New South Wales. We don't actually know why he gave this land this name, but we presume it's because the land area reminded him of Wales, well, at least South Wales. And the island of Tasmania is named after the Dutch explorer and navigator Abel Tasman, who was the first European to reach the island, as well as the first European to reach New Zealand too, and the first to sight the Fiji Islands. So yeah, I think it's fair that he gets an island named after him. Those 4 names I just covered in all honesty are still pretty uninteresting, simply being named after people of interest. In one case it's the same person twice, or similar geography. However, these are super interesting when compared to what the other 3 Australian states are called, with these being called South Australia, Western Australia, and North Australia. Well, actually it's called the Northern Territory, and it's not actually a state but a territory, though nevertheless, the name still sucks. And if you thought these names were pretty to the point, then I have some bad news for you. These literal Australian names go deeper than just being present at a state level. I found listicles online of, and I quote, Australian place names that need no explanation, and 13 Aussie place names that won't keep you guessing. So clearly it's not just myself who has noticed just how literal Australians can be sometimes with their nomenclature. So I would love to know from my Australian views if this is a known thing / joke in the nation. And of course, if you're Australian, do you live in or near somewhere with a really literal or obvious name? Anyway, let's get back to some of these really literally named Aussie locations. Like I said, there are many of them and you should go check them out for yourselves, but my favourite include Red Rock, named due to there being a red rock in the area; 7 Mile Beach, named because it's a 7 mile beach; Black Mountain, named because it's a black mountain; Circular Pool, named because it's a circular pool; Big Bend, named because it's a big bend in a river; Granite Island, named because it's an island with granite in it; and the name of the most northern point of Northern Australia, which is simply called the Top End. Though it's not just geographic names that can end up being rather literal in Australia. Australia is home to some amazing wildlife, and as cool as these animals are, a lot of their names leave a lot to be desired. Perhaps 2 of the types of animals Australia is most renowned for is their snakes and their spiders. 2 quite common fears, so apologies for that. Head to this time to be free of pictures of snakes and spiders, and only say this because I hate spiders myself, so wish me luck fam to look at pictures of these guys. There are quite a few Australian snakes with pretty obvious names. Perhaps the best example of this would be with the brown snakes, specifically the western brown snake and the eastern brown snake, named due to the fact they are both brown. Like I said, this is some pretty literal stuff. However, despite this dull name, the 2 brown snakes are considered to be some of the most troublesome snakes in the country, with the brown snakes being responsible for more deaths than any other group of snakes. In regards to literally named snakes, we also have the small-eyed snake, it has small eyes, and the red-bellied black snake, which, you guessed it, is black with a red belly. For spiders in Oz, we have the white-tailed spider, named because it has white on its tail. However, my favourite example of a spider with an obvious name is this one. If you showed a picture of this spider to people, I imagine a lot of them would call it a black widow, and it's easy to understand why. It looks a lot like a black widow, however it isn't one, which is fine enough, things can look similar in the animal kingdom. However, the name black widow is seriously cool and evocative, so does this Australian equivalent have an equally cool name? Well, no. In traditional Australian fashion, it's just called the red-back spider, as it has red on its back. This is just a small selection of places and animals with pretty literal dull names in Australia, though it leads me to thinking to myself, why is this the case here in the land down under? I imagine it's a variety of reasons, and a lot of this is my own theorising. It most likely has a lot to do with the history that has taken place in Australia. Australia is a relatively new country, especially in regards to the way the nation is today, though that's not to say that the landmass and the current inhabitants appeared out of thin air. Australia has a very ancient history too, and that's something we'll be looking into later. Because of how modern a lot of Australia is, especially some of the settlements and the aforementioned states, it means that not a lot of history has taken place in them, so names deeply rooted in history or from a language of another time simply weren't able to exist. So these obvious, almost placeholder-like names were just put in place instead. I'm looking at you, Western Australia. Though this didn't really need to be the case, as there is deep history and ancient language in Australia that people could have pulled from when naming their settlements and states. Though it seems that the early colonisers and settlers of Australia weren't too interested in finding out about the history or language of the Aboriginal Australians, preferring to give places obvious dull names than names of interest steeped in the history and language of the Aboriginals. Also, it may not really be the Australian settlers we have to blame for these names, but more likely the British officials who are shaping Australia into what it has since become. Let's look at the aforementioned Western Australia. The British formally claimed possession of the land in 1719 at just a point they call Possession Point. They called a point they claimed possession over Possession Point. The dull name red flag should have been going off then. By the early 19th century, the British were worried that the French might claim land here too, so the British simply claimed the entirety of Western Australia for themselves and dubbed it Western Australia. So yes, it's the Brits to blame for that one. Even the aforementioned brown snake once had a more interesting name. Initially it was dubbed in French the Furine Chilincoti, which means knitted furin, and this name references the row of fine mesh pattern on its body that reminded the namer Jules Verlu of fine stockings. Now this is a way more interesting and fun name in my mind. Think, I could have been giving you guys a what snake is named after stockings video if history played out differently, but instead the English language came bouldering in and simply dubbed this brown coloured snake the brown snake. Though maybe I'm being too one-sided in all this. Despite what I've been saying, there are some really interesting names in Australia. In fact, the name Australia itself is pretty interesting. The name Australia derives from the idea of Terra Australis, meaning the southern lands in Latin. Before the entire world was explored, it was believed that there was a mass of land in the southern hemisphere just as big as the land in the northern hemisphere, so they dubbed it and preemptively drew it onto maps Terra Australis. So when actual Australia was discovered, the name Terra Australis was adapted and applied to it, and of course I have a whole video about it which just hit 1 million views, so thank you all. As well as interesting names, it's also home to some really funny, silly names. I can't mention all of them here as they'll most likely get this video demonetized, but Tasmania alone is home to the places of Granny's Gut, Tinkle Creek, Lovely Bottom, Humongous Hole, the Never Never, and the Grunter, just to name a few. Seriously, some of these get pretty lowbrow, so go check them out. There'll be a link down below. And luckily for us, there are a plethora of towns, regions, beaches, rivers, mountains, etc. too that have names from Aboriginal origins. I mean, I won't even attempt to say many of these, but Wikipedia has a huge list of them all. But we have fun names like Amaru, Narara, Buragoon, Chadingwara, and Toowoomba, just to name a selection. And of course we have animals with Aboriginal names too. The ones that come to mind for me are the wonderful mammals that Australia has, with wonderful names like wallaby, bilby, dingo, koala, and of course kangaroo. All these names seem to derive from Aboriginal origins, and I'm so happy they've stuck around. Imagine if the British gave them dull literal names like pouch rabbit, leaf monkey, and grumpy dog. And thankfully, due to the respect that Aboriginals have been given over time, more Aboriginal names have become present in the country. Perhaps the best example being the two official names of one of the most renowned landmarks the country has to offer. I remember this being called just Ayers Rock when I was younger, named after former Chief Secretary of South Australia John Ayres. However, in 1993 it was given back its original Aboriginal name of Uluru, and this led to many other Australian landmarks having dual names, from the dull like Western Australia to the fun like Lovely Bottom to the ancient like Uluru. Australia is a country full of interesting names. Now, I just hope that my wonderful Australian viewers are aware of just how tongue-in-cheek the title of this video is, and how light-hearted this video has been on a whole. Personally, I just hope that this video doesn't get me sentenced to a booting. Covered Australia's relationship with names in the past, and I've been taking tongue-in-cheek jabs at them ever since. In that video, I summarised that Australian place names can be put into two main categories. There's the incredibly obvious literal place names like Western Australia, and places that hold on to native Aboriginal names like Bondi. However, there's actually something of a third side to this Australian nomenclature coin, that being weird and rude names that litter the nation. Whole maps have been created to highlight highlight the bizarre names of the land down under. While these names can be found across the entire country, there seems to be a higher concentration of these odd names in one particular area of the nation, that being on the island of Tasmania. Yes, the island of Tasmania is a state of Australia, which many of you like to inform me of when I forgot to include it that one time. It seems that many people just presume that Tasmania is a wilderness island, and while it does have stunning scenery and very unique wildlife, presuming it's just an uninhabited island is far from the truth. It has a population of over 500,000 people and is the 26th largest island on our planet. It's around the same size as Sri Lanka. The island state is also home to some of the world's cleanest air and the world's oldest trees. As for that name, well, it's a creation of European origins. Tasmania is named after Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who sighted the island in 1642. He, however, actually named it Van Diemen's Land in honor of Governor of the Dutch East Indies Anthony van Diemen. The name Tasmania began life as a mere nickname for the island, in ode to its European founder. However, the name started to become more popular than the actual name and was officially changed in 1856. Of course, the island was inhabited way before Tasman even sighted it, and its original Aboriginal names include Trowunna, Trowena, and Leochowita. While Tasmania was once its nickname, it now has a different nickname, the Apple Isle. I've read two ideas as to why the island has this nickname. One being because in the past, the island was an important apple exporter, and the other idea being simply because it looks somewhat like an apple. Of course, while it's all well and good to look into the name of the island as a whole, we're really here to look into the specific names of settlements on the island. And this phenomenon of weird places in Tasmania can really be encapsulated in this map of the island. This small map has really made its way around the internet, and yes, I've been sent it a handful of times. It's actually part of a much larger map of weird Australian names as a whole, created by the Marvelous Maps company. They have maps of other countries with weird names too, go check them out. They aren't sponsoring this video or anything, but I'm hoping if I say nice things about them, they may send me a free map or two. Anyway, it's understandable as to why this map has become so popular to share on the socials. Just look at some of the names we have going on here, from Shag Head, Wombat Flat, Little Hell, Pisspot Creek, Granny's Gut, Deep Fort, the Never Never, the Nipples, Snug, and Big Trumpeter Bay, just to name a few. The island is home to names that would make even the most respectable person smirk. How exactly did this island end up with so many weird and rude names? Of course, Tasmania/Australia isn't the only place with rude names, and there's a select few reasons as to why place names can seem rude to us now. A prime reason is because of old words picking up new meanings. Take Shag Head as we just mentioned, a place in Tasmania. Or shag is now a word we link with copulation. Initially, shag was the name for a family of birds, and still somewhat is. I wouldn't be surprised if the shag mentioned in this name relates to the bird, though as years went on and shag took on this new meaning, the name became much more comical. As for the head part, this is a common term we apply to land by water. There's also a shag bay on the island too. Another reason why names can seem rude to English speakers is because an unassuming word in a foreign language can sound rude to us in English. While these ideas explain the occasional odd name, it doesn't help us with understanding why odd names appear at such a large scale on the island of Tasmania. Plus, it really can't explain some of the odder names on the island like Eggs and Bacon Bay, Lovely Bottom, and Ding Dong Rainforest. As to why they are so prevalent here, we don't seem to be too sure. When looking into this, there are countless articles poking fun at these names, but no one was really asking why they are so odd and so frequent. So for this one, I have to go into more name theory than name explain. What I'm about to talk about is an idea of my own creation with little to no actual evidence. That's something I really want to make clear. While I primarily enjoy giving you guys the facts, sometimes the facts elude us and we have to go into tinfoil hat mode. So what's my theory as to why these odd names are so commonplace? Well, it kind of roots from this single sentence I found on the Discover Tasmania website and their page about the island's odd names. They say these unusual place names reflect the island's colourful history, and when I think of colourful history in Tasmania, Australia's convict past comes to mind. Australia's history of convicts has become muddled over the years. A lot of the time people like to boil it down to the stereotype that all Australians are just descendants of thieves and criminals criminals, and they let that paint their entire impression of the nation. Of course, we shouldn't base our idea of an entire nation on a stereotype, but British convicts being sent there does play a role in the history of Australia. It's believed that 1 in 5 Australians today can trace their lineage back to a convict. Britain started sending convicts to the land in the 18th century. This was post-industrial revolution, and the landscape of Britain changed drastically. Small villages in the British countryside were abandoned as people flocked to the big cities for work, and while there was work in these post-industrial revolution cities, there simply wasn't enough for everyone. So these cities became squalid and overcrowded with the unemployed who had no work and no money. This created something Britain had never really seen in a large scale before, and something it still struggles with to this day: urban poverty. These people turned to crime simply to survive in this now changed world. They had to steal food to feed themselves. Of course, these crimes were taken seriously, and the authorities had to deal with these new troublemakers one way or another. Serious crimes were punishable by death, but for petty things like theft, a prison sentence was installed. Soon enough, Britain's prisons were at max capacity. Britain simply needed somewhere to put all their inmates that their revolution created in the first place. With an empire at its fingertips, there had to be somewhere they could send them, right? To begin with, Britain actually sent their convicts to the Americas, but after a few battles and some catchy tunes, that wasn't really an option for the UK anymore. Australia, or New Holland as it was called at the time, was already known of to Britain. James Cook had mapped it out years before, and it seemed like the perfect place to leave convicts. Not only was it empty in their eyes, obviously they ignored the Aboriginals who had been there for thousands of years, but the harsh, hot environment and the 8-month boat trip made it seem like a very suitable punishment, even for just stealing a loaf of bread. Life was tough for these initial convicts down under, trying to figure out how to farm the land with food in short supply, and once their sentences were carried out, these convicts weren't sent back to Blighty. Rather, they lived their life in Australia, carrying the stigma of their crimes. Over the years, this shame in their history has become a point of pride in Australia, and a brighter light has been shone on the harsh conditions these convicts had to endure at the hands of the British Empire, especially for the trivial crimes many of them committed in the first place. Transportation of convicts to Australia started in 1788 and ended in 1868, with 160,000 British convicts being sent to the land. From what I read, 70,000 of these people were sent to the island of Tasmania. It was in 1804 that the first convict ship landed on the island. Who knows if life here was any different to the lives of convicts on mainland Australia? Were they sent to the island simply as there was space there, or was Tasmania seen as the next step up? When being sent from the UK to Australia wasn't enough, they had to be then sent to an even more remote location. Either way, Tasmania made itself home to many British convicts who led their life there, and places settled by convicts can still be found all across the island. Now I know what you are thinking. What has Australia's convict history got to do with a whole lot of weird place names on the island of Tasmania? Well, not only did it help bulk out this video, it also plays into my theory as to why there's so many weird names on the island. And once again, remember, this is just my own theory. But if there's any group of people on our planet who are going to give a huge amount of places weird, silly and rude names, surely 18th and 19th century convicts of urban Britain from low income backgrounds have to be a prime contender, right? I can just imagine the Dickensian archetypal crook giving somewhere a name like Grassy Bottom, Ass's Ear, or even Humongous Hole. Place names in the New World, and I'm not quite sure if Australia counts as the New World, but you get the point, are usually bestowed upon from quite lofty places and have respectable origins. Think of the South American nations or Australian settlements named after important figures. All the names simply come from ancient roots which we have held onto. Tasmania, however, didn't really have big wigs or fancy governors to guide its nomenclature, especially for its lesser known areas. What it did have, however, were convicts. I can't help but feel that British convicts from poor backgrounds in the 18th and 19th century wouldn't have put the same amount of thought and finesse into place names as governors, politicians, liberated peoples, and name nerds in general would have. Instead, they may have just given places easy to understand names, or even silly and rude names as those words were in their lexicon. These names may have even been a way to find some humour in their otherwise tough lives as convicts dragged to the other side of the world. Hopefully, these names brought a smile to their faces faces, in the same way they bring a smile to our faces today. Like, there's a mountain on the island called the Nipples. Who do you think is more likely to name a mountain this? A fancy mountaineering survey team, or some working class inner city English convicts having a laugh? Though maybe this is a huge disservice to the Dickensian convict to presume they were all dumb and gave places rude names just to get a kick out of it. As I stated many times, this really is just my own theory on the matter as to explain why there are so many odd names on the island. If you have your own theory as to why this is the case, then I'd love to hear it down below. Maybe we can get a better idea as to why these names are so odd if we look at them on an individual level. I'm sure many of you came here just to hear some of these silly names, and while I've shared a few of them, this video really hasn't been that. Apologies. I wanted to find out why these names are so common, not just laugh at them. There's enough articles out there doing just that. Though to share a few actual etymologies of these names, we have Snug, which is believed to be named after how snugly sailors' ships fitted in their ports. Nowhere Else was named because its road went on to nowhere else, and the small town of Penguin was named after the fairy penguins that still inhabit its coast to this day.
Anyway, on with today's name of Bruce, and this is actually a name of Norman origin, and it's believed to come from the town of Brix in France. I imagine that X might be silent in some way, might just be Bli. I don't know, I should have had to pronounce that one. It's B-R-I-X. Probably mispronounced that one, but what's new there? And it's also thought to mean from the brushwood thicket, so whether it comes from this town of France, whether it's this brushwood thicket etymology, or whether it's an amalgamation of both, this is definitely a geographic based name. It was most likely a surname to begin with before becoming a first name. As a Norman name, it of course arrived on the British Isles thanks to the Norman conquest in 1066. However, when here in Britain, it became super popular not in England, but up north in Scotland. This was thanks to their king of Robert the Bruce, who was a king in the 14th century, I believe. I wrote that down, but I should have checked. Gosh, that's wild. Pretty sure it's the 14th century. And what was so amazing about him is he actually freed Scotland from English rule. He created Scottish freedom. As Robert the Bruce became such a beloved figure in Scotland, the name grew in popularity in Scotland and then across the entire world. And I mean quite literally the entire world, all around the world, as despite this name being of Scottish/Norman origins, it's much more associated with one different country in particular, Australia. The name Bruce is so heavily linked to Australia. In fact, I read that Bruce is just a generic name for men over in the country, how we use bloke over here, or like how they use Sheila for women. Apparently Bruce is the male equivalent. How did this happen, however? How did this name of Scottish Norman root end up so popular literally down under on the complete opposite side of the world? Well, I'm sure you know that Australia is a nation founded on migration. People from all across the UK migrated from England and the UK to Australia. And of course, the popular idea is that they're all convicts, and there's a hell of a lot more to it than just all the bad people being sent to Australia. Honestly, it's a really fascinating story. I made a video about Tasmania recently, and I talked about it all more in detail there. So there'll be a link here below, here up there maybe. Go check it out. It's a really interesting video and explains this story much more. And it's more than just bad people were sent to Australia. And of course, those people from the UK going to Australia, some of them were Scottish. In fact, I believe that 25% of modern Australians have Scottish roots in them. And with that many Scots in the country, it was inevitable that they would bring the name Bruce with them, as the Scots loved the name Bruce so much. And over the years, as the population of Australia grew, the name Bruce grew with it too. And it got to this breaking point where Bruce just became synonymous with the land. I think a certain Monty Python sketch may have helped as well. It's worth reiterating that Bruce is just a stereotype. Not every Australian man is actually called Bruce. It's just a silly concept. And while Bruce is still heavily linked with Australia, in the past, the name was actually linked with something else entirely too. In the past, Bruce was seen as a very homosexual name, and now I just need to state there's nothing wrong with being homosexual, being gay, and there's nothing wrong with certain things being linked with homosexuality. Though what is bad is when those things linked with homosexuality are portrayed as bad things and avoided because of that link. That's when things get rubbish. So, in example, a lot of stereotypically homosexual men were labelled as Bruce. It became something of a slur for gay men. And the most noticeable example of this is with the 1978 Incredible Hulk TV show. You know the one, the classic old Hulk show with big green Louis Ferrigno, that one. In the original Hulk comic books and in the modern Marvel MCU films, of course you know the Hulk's real name is Bruce Banner. He has the name of Bruce. However, in this TV show, it was changed to David Banner. And this isn't 100% confirmed, but the popular theory is, and some people even claimed it themselves, is that they changed his name from Bruce to David in this show because the TV network thought the name Bruce was too gay, which is just rubbish on so many levels. It's not rubbish because this name is linked with homosexuality. As I mentioned, there's nothing wrong with that link and there's nothing wrong with being gay in general. What's rubbish is that this link has put people off the name. It's also incredibly rubbish that this name was used to discriminate against homosexual men. Luckily, this doesn't really seem to be the case anymore. No one really seems to be afraid to use the name Bruce. In the USA, the name Bruce is the 472nd most popular boy's name. It really peaked across the 40s, 50s and 60s as a really popular name, just sort of there. And a lot of popular Bruces we have now were born in that sort of time period. Here in the UK, it's the 598th most popular boy's name, so more popular in the USA, but still somewhat popular here in the top 1000. Though of course you might be surprised to hear that where the name isn't too popular is of course in Australia. One article I read said that in 2018 just 8 baby Bruces were born, so yeah, I think because of this stereotype the name Bruce has actually fallen quite far out of fashion in Australia. Famous Bruces of course include Bruce Springsteen, the famous singer and guitar man and just all round good egg. There's also Bruce Lee, famous martial artist and expert whose actual name was Lee Jun-fan. We mentioned Bruce Banner, but there's also Bruce Wayne, the real name of Batman. And one other one I really enjoy is that the shark in Jaws was also known as Bruce, and that's why they call the shark in Finding Nemo Bruce too. As for video game Bruce, there's Bruce Irvin from the Tekken series. I haven't played Tekken in years, I don't actually remember this guy, but apparently he's been there for quite some time. I never really appealed to the human characters. I always plays the weird ones. Mokujin, I really like Mokujin. And there's a kangaroo and a bear. And there's like a little orange dinosaur in one of the games as well. And I believe that was like a character from another show. If you know what that little orange dinosaur was in Tekken 2 maybe, let me know down below. I'd love to hear from you. But anyway, that's just about everything you guys need to know about the name Bruce. But what are your thoughts on this name? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Do you know anyone with the name Bruce? Are you called Bruce yourself? Let me know down in the comments below.
Accents are weird things, aren't they? Like, I understand why different people from around the world end up speaking different languages, but why on earth have people ended up sounding different depending on where they come from? Why do specific places affect the way we speak? It seems that accents come about when people have been living together for a long enough period of time and pick up on specific speech patterns from one another until eventually everyone in the community speaks in a similar way. Accents are way more than just the way we speak, however. Not only can an accent signify where we come from, but it can also signify what socio-economic background we come from too. In example, a rich person and a poor person from the same part of London will most likely speak differently. They're truly fascinating things. This has of course led to some accents being more beloved than others. Undoubtedly, however, one of the most beloved accents has to be the one this video is all about, that being the dialect spoken by those from the land down under, the Australian accent. It really is one of those accents that pretty much everyone knows straight away, and everyone has attempted to do it themselves with varying degrees of success. What I find most interesting about this accent is that it's not entirely native to the land. The modern nation of Australia is primarily made up of descendants from settlers from other parts of the world, much like other nations like the USA or Brazil. This is different to many other nations, which have inhabitants that have lived there for many years and have accents that are native to the land, like French and Irish in example. So where exactly did the Australian accent come from? To start with, the official language of the nation should give you a pretty clear idea as to where this story begins. While Aussies speak English, Australian English has very much become its own unique thing. Not only do they speak English, but the Union Jack is part of their flag too. If you haven't guessed by now, Australia and the United Kingdom are very much interlinked nations. Australia was in fact a colony of the British Empire from 1788 until 1901. This explains to us not only why they speak English, but also shows us how exactly that famous accent started to take shape. As mentioned, the British colonization of Australia started in 1788. It was in this year that the famous First Fleet arrived in the continent. This fleet of 11 ships left Portsmouth in the southeast of England on the 13th of May 1787, carrying over 1,400 inhabitants to their new home. At this time, Australia had no European settlements, so making the land habitable was quite the challenge for the people on these ships. On these 11 boats were a huge variety of people. There were high-ranking government and military officials who'd be running the operation once they landed in Australia, but these officials brought their families with them too. On top of this, you had the ship's crew members members, but also people who'd fill important roles once they arrived in the land, like builders, cooks, and various other workers, though most famously of course are the convicts on these boats too. There were thought to be around 700 to 800 convicts aboard the 11 ships of the First Fleet. They were being sent to Australia simply due to the growing amount of prisoners in Britain. This is something we covered in much more detail in our video about Tasmania's strange name, so go check that out. To summarise, the British Empire used Australia as a plaster for their prisoner problem, rather than fixing the problem outright. Australia wasn't just a dumping ground for Britain's convicts, as various stereotypes like to depict. Regardless as to why there were convicts in Australia, they definitely were there, as well as many other people, from fancy government officials and their fancy families to other various workers who were enlisted to create this new colony. All these people would have come from different parts of Great Britain and would have come from different socio-economic backgrounds too. This meant that not only did this huge variety of people arrive in Australia, but their huge variety of accents arrived in the land too. Great Britain is home to many accents and dialects, despite its relatively small size. One source pointed out that there were up to 300 different accents on this island. These changes in voice can be seen on a large scale when comparing someone from the north of England to someone from the south. However, there are even slight differences in the way people speak in counties right next to each other. Even people from different boroughs of London can speak differently. It's an island full of a staggering amount of accents, and an awful lot of these accents made their way over to Australia with the First Fleet. In the 18th century, people didn't travel as much as they do now, especially people from lower economic backgrounds. This meant that many of these people may have never heard some of these other British accents before, let alone understand them. Communicating with one another became quite a challenge, and when you are literally on the opposite side of the earth trying to create a new community from scratch in the blazing Australian heat, you kind of need to be able to communicate with one another efficiently. From the fact that Australia is still around to this day, we can gather that these various people did manage to communicate with one another, despite the disparities in their dialect. How did they do this, however? Well, something happened to the way in which these various British people spoke their language. This something is known as dialect levelling. Dialect levelling is something that happens in the world of language and linguistics, in which various distinct variations of a language strip away the things that make them distinct for ease of understanding. Words present in one dialect but not in another would be removed, and other words that are pronounced differently in different accents would be levelled out and be said in a way that fits all the different dialects and accents. Removing all these quirks and traits in a language and getting to the bare bones of it really help people who speak the same language but in vastly different accents and dialects communicate with one another, and this is exactly what happened in Australia and set the wheels in motion for the birth of the Aussie accent. This birth didn't happen overnight, however. It was after 50 years from that initial European settlement of Australia that the accent that we all know and love started to appear. Those initial settlers still alive after 50 years would have undoubtedly changed the way they spoke, but the real change of the accent would have come with descendants, the kids and grandkids of the initial settlers who would have spent their entire life in the accent melting pot that Australia had become. These children would have really sounded how Australians sound today. Of course, it was a huge mixture of accents that went into the creation of the Australian accent we have today, though some dialects and accents are seen as being a bit more pivotal and had a larger influence in the sound of the speech today. It seems that the South East English accent is seen as one of the key players in the Aussie accent. This makes an awful lot of sense. The First Fleet left from Portsmouth, which is in the southeast of England, and the southeast is one of the most popular parts of the country. The southeast houses London, so many important figures and convicts on these boats would have arrived from the capital. More specifically in London, we have the Cockney accent too. Cockney is seen very much as the precursor of the Australian accent. There are definitely similarities between the two, that's for sure. Likewise, Scottish is seen as having a large influence on the Australian accent too. However, there's one huge omission I haven't mentioned in this video yet, and that's the native accents of the Australian Aboriginals. I've read conflicting things as to whether their accent affected the Australian accent. Some say it had a direct impact on the way Aussies speak, while other sources point out that it's the other way around. While Aboriginal names and words are very present across Australia, it seems that accent isn't quite as abundant. Pretty much as soon as the accent emerged, it was instantly beloved. What's even more surprising is that when it first came about, Australian English and their Australian accent was seen by scholars of the time as the purest form of the English language. This purity of the Australian accent goes back to the dialect levelling we mentioned earlier. The people of Australia had come to speak English without any of the local quirks that plague the various forms of English spoken in the UK, all because this accent and way of speaking was born out of a means to communicate easily and efficiently. Author of The Story of Australian English, Kel Richard, explained it best, saying that Australian English is English with the dialect variations taken out. Unfortunately, this love of the Aussie accent and its position as the purest form of English wouldn't stay around for too long. Across the 18th and 19th century, some huge changes were made to the English language and the way in which it was perceived. The most noticeable change was the introduction of the concept of received pronunciation, known as RP for short. RP is named by many other names: BBC English, the Queen's English, and Oxford English, to name a few examples. It's that definitively British accent spoken by the likes of the Queen and those who present the news on BBC. It was in this period of time that RP was put on a pedestal and declared the definitive way of speaking the language. Not only was it seen as the definitive way of speaking English, but those who spoke with this kind of accent were seen as superior to other English speakers. Those who didn't speak like this in not just the UK but across the empire in general were looked down upon. It's worth noting here that despite being seen as the stereotypical way in which British people speak to this very day, very few British people actually speak in RP on a regular everyday basis. It's pretty much just the royal family and the rest of the upper echelons of British society at this point. Despite this, however, it meant that the once beloved Australian accent had gone from being seen as the purest form of English to being a rather harsh, rough and coarse accent. Sorry, Australia. Soon enough, RP was being taught in classrooms all across the empire, including Australia. Not only were young Aussies being taught to speak like this, but many posh Aussies started to use RP too, to distance themselves from their traditional Aussie accents, what was seen as unpleasant sounding in the time. Even once the country gained its independence from the UK in 1901, people were still trying to speak with an RP accent and sound less Australian. All this brings us to today. Luckily nowadays there isn't as much stock put into RP, and by and large people aren't shamed or judged for the accents they have, at least they shouldn't be anyway. Luckily for us, RP's boost in popularity in the 19th century didn't wipe out the Aussie accent. Though what's so interesting about this dialect is that in its roughly 200 years of existence, not many variations of the accent have actually emerged. There are a few variations of the Australian accent, and the variations that do exist aren't particularly related to geography, like the accents of the UK or USA in example. The Aussie accent really doesn't change that much depending on where you are from. Most sources claim that there are just 3 different versions of the Aussie accent, and these are more defined by socio-economic backgrounds as opposed to geographic backgrounds. These 3 are called general, broad and cultivated. General Australian is by far the most common Aussie accent you hear. It's the way in which the vast majority of the nation speak. Someone like Hugh Jackman is a prime example of this kind of Aussie accent. Broad Australian is the accent spoken by people living in more rural areas, part of the nation that are more isolated and would have been less affected by RP and its influence in the 18th century. A great example of a broad Australian accent is with Steve Irwin. Cultivated Australian is perhaps the least Australian sounding of these 3 variations. It seems this accent is most linked with the high society of Australia, those whose ancestors did in fact pick up on RP all those years ago. I read that Kate Blanchett is a prime example of someone with a cultivated Australian accent. In all honesty, I didn't even know she was an Aussie. The history of this accent is an interesting one, that's for sure. From being born out of necessity for easy communication between people from vastly different backgrounds, to being considered the pinnacle of English, to being shunned thanks to RP, to being the beloved accent it is to this day. It's even evolved more so to become its own thing, with unique Australian words and phrases. In fact, you could call this form of English and the accent sweet as bro. That's what they say in Australia, right? Thank you to all my patrons who support Name Explain on a monthly basis. Patreon is vital to Name Explain, and donating just $2 a month allows you to enjoy ad-free videos and bonus Patreon exclusive content. It also allows you to help choose what names get explained in upcoming videos, and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you so much for all the support you guys give Name Explain. Thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. Check out another video and subscribe to stay in the loop on all things Name Explain. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT, and also join the Facebook group Friends on Name Explain, both of which will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.